Today we're continuing our conversation about parenting children in a sexualized culture. So Pastor Dan, let me just ask this really obvious question I'm sure parents are wondering right now. Yeah. What do I tell my kids about sex?
Yeah.
If I want to be a good, solid Christian, biblical Christian parent?
Yeah. Well, first of all, sex is God's plan. It's His design. Mm-hmm. That's the good news that we have, right? Is that He created this. He created us sexual beings. And I think, just to keep it really simple, I think there's 4 key points, and I'll make these really easy to remember. 4 P's to God's design for sex. The first is pleasure. Sex is pleasurable, and parents, I think it is important that be a starting place for us, because ultimately it was God's design that it be pleasurable. Now, this is also what the world is telling our kids when it comes to sex. And so I think it's important just that we understand that it's not a bad thing to teach our kids. It's actually a helpful thing to teach them. Mm-hmm. And then the second P that I would say is that one of the purposes of sex is procreation. And maybe think about this a little bit differently. Yes, I am talking about the biology of sex, that a new life is formed when a husband and a wife, that can be the result of biblical sexuality. But that new life is not just in the form of a baby. The Bible talks about in Genesis, and it mentions this over and over again, that a husband and a wife shall be joined and the two shall become one flesh. That one flesh is a new creation as well. That the sexual union of a husband and a wife and them coming together and forming that bond is a new creation. And I think that's the other piece and purpose of sex is it does bring biological life into the world, but it brings life to that marriage. It brings life to that relationship with our spouse. And then the third P that I would talk about with my kids is ultimately that sex is one of the purposes is for protection. And we see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul says that a husband's body doesn't belong to him, a wife's body doesn't belong to her, but our bodies belong to each other, and stop depriving one another. Because what Paul knew is that sex is such a good thing that we would abuse it, that we would idolize it. And so he reminds us here that part of the purpose of sex, of the sexual union of a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, is for protection, to protect us from the sinful nature, but from the temptations that the enemy will bring. And so that's an important piece of that as well.
Yeah, but, and Dan, I would say to that point, I think this is good for husbands and wives, thinking about this, is my wife knows this mm-hmm. third thing, that she's a part of protecting me, right? Right? And I think for husbands and wives to acknowledge that, I know this is a parenting topic that we're talking through, but it's good for them maybe to say, I never really even thought about it like that. Yeah. That all of my sexuality goes through my wife. She knows it, I know it, she knows that she's the key to me not being involved in any other side things, right? Yeah. And vice versa, the same is true the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely, well said. The fourth P that I think is the most important of all of these things. We've talked about the pleasure, the procreation, the protection, but really the big one to teach our kids is that sex is a proclamation. And what I mean by that is the sexual activity between a husband and a wife proclaims something. It tells a story. Mm-hmm. It's part of a story. And again, we see this throughout Scripture where the analogy of marriage is used to describe God and His love for us, mm-hmm. and even our relationship with Jesus. He's the bridegroom, and the church is the bride. And so when we think about proclamation, we think about the story that sex tells. Mm-hmm. And this is very important because the culture is also telling a story. Mm-hmm. They're casting a vision and a story for our kids about what sex is and what it isn't. The Bible does that as well. And the cool thing is, as we teach our kids this biblical truth, is we are inviting them into that story, that bigger story, that story that God, from the beginning, created them. He created them male and female. In the image of God, He created them. And so really, when you think about sex, it begins with identity, not behavior. This proclamation of being a male image bearer or being a female image bearer is all tied into that story. And so as we teach our kids about God's design for sex, it's so important to show them where their role is in that story and make them a bigger part of that. And I think when we do that well, when we are able to talk to them about sex in that way, it really takes a lot of the stigma that parents have about talking about this topic and being scared to address these things, and all of a sudden it becomes a privilege. It's a privilege to talk to my kids and to teach them this and to show them that.
Yeah, and I love that it is about being proactive. It's about going on the offensive to talk to our kids, because the enemy is the enemy is
Absolutely.
proactive about this in a sexualized culture.
Yeah, and what I would say to that is, here's the truth, parents. Sex education, no matter what your kid's age is right now, sex education is happening with your kids. Your question, and that you and I have to answer as parents, is who do we want to be the primary source of information about sex to our kids? Do we want it to be the culture at large? Or do we want it to be us? Do we want it to be us in the context of a loving parent relationship with our kids, introducing them to the creator of sex?